中共建政75年来任期最长的国家主席习近平，打破了任期制的限制之后，被认为很有可能会终身执政。英国《经济学人》杂志的封面曾经让习近平穿上龙袍，有人说他像是要大一统的秦始皇，也有人说他像越勤政越亡国的崇祯帝。不过，在耶鲁大学教授、历史学家文安立的眼中，习近平更像是大清帝国盛世乾隆执政的晚期，或是一战爆发之前的德皇威廉二世。曾经著有《躁动的帝国：从乾隆到邓小平的中国与世界》一书的文安立教授，长期研究中国的现代化。他在耶鲁大学接受美国之音纵深视角专访，解构北京100年国耻的迷思，揭开中共为何能够超越苏共，维持政权长达75年的历史真相。同时，他也提出了一个非常重要的历史叩问，那就是假如没有共产党，今日的中国会是一个什么模样？本期纵深视角，让我们跟随历史学家文安立的视角，一起去探索中共的前世、今生与未来。So, Professor Westad, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
It's a great pleasure, Daphne. Thank you for inviting me.
In your book, The Restless Empire, you mentioned that during a walk in the old summer palace, you were inspired to write. So first, could you please share with us your encounters with China and what sparked your interest in Chinese history?
So I got interested in China first and foremost through the language. So I was interested in studying Chinese. I started studying Chinese when I was an undergraduate at the University of Oslo many, many years ago. And then I went to China several times as a student, studying Chinese, trying to improve my Chinese, mostly failing at improving my Chinese, but at least getting it up to a level where I could do some reading in Chinese and have some simple conversations with people. And then after many years, I started taking an interest in China's history. So this was when Chinese sources and information about China started to open up in the late 1980s and 1990s. Right? So I was very lucky. I already had some of the linguistic and cultural skills. And for that particular book, I was visiting Beijing and I was thinking about how to try to do a bigger book on the international history of China. And that's where the Yuanmingyuan, the old summer palace, comes in, because I used to go for my morning walks there, and I was struck, with the destruction, obviously, of that palace in 1860 by British and French troops, and by some local troops that joined them for those purposes. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be interesting to try to do a book about the long-term interactions between China and the outside world? Not just the history of China, but thinking about how peacefully and through war, through commerce and through conflict, China had interacted with the outside world. So that was the starting point for thinking about that book.
The CCP and Chinese President Xi Jinping, they claim that only CCP can lead China. So I'm wondering that from a historian's perspective, is that really historically inevitable or just a coincidence? What key factors led to the founding of PRC?
So obviously there are historical reasons why the CCP is in power in China. But that's not the same thing as saying that would be the only logical outcome or even the natural outcome. The CCP is in power in China because it conquered that power by force through a civil war in which the CCP came out on top. That was why they were able to set up the PRC. So it's not difficult to explain why that happened, but one has to be very careful with believing that it was the only possible outcome for China. So therefore, to me, it doesn't make any sense to say that only the CCP could lead China. There have been many contenders for leading China, and I'm sure some of them, for the Chinese people in many ways, would have done it equally well, if not better, than what the CCP has. So this identification that you see now among a lot of people, not just at the top levels of the party, between the CCP and China, I think is a mistake.
But CCP has encountered many crises, like 1989 and also the Cultural Revolution. How has it endured for 75 years?
It has endured mainly by the willingness to use force against its own population whenever they are challenged for power. It's not the only explanation, but it's an important explanation. In addition to that, they've also been very flexible. I mean, they've been able to change their views on even central issues as to how to run the economy or how to structure society to a degree that is almost unimaginable. I mean, if you look at what the party stood for in the 1960s and compare it to what the party stood for 20 years later or today, those are completely different things, right? And that flexibility has probably served the CCP well in many ways. Whether it served China well is a very different story, because these enormous fluctuations back and forth, both in terms of the economy and in terms of politics, has been a challenge for a lot of Chinese people who lived through those eras. It's been very, very difficult. And it's still difficult today.
You mentioned use of force. Does that mean that the strategy for CCP to stay in power is violent?
If necessary.
Part of
If necessary. I mean, so the party has become, as we have seen, much more oriented towards cooperation, at least with significant parts of the population, over the past generation and a half. And I think that has been generally a successful kind of direction. But there is absolutely no doubt on my side that if challenged for power in China, the party would use the power that it is at its disposal in order to defend itself, even against its own people. We've seen examples of that, of course, before. I'm not saying that that's unique to the CCP, if you think about it globally, but it certainly is one of the features of the Chinese Communist Party that has kept them in power for as long as they have. So that mixture of ideological flexibility, extreme ideological flexibility, and a willingness to defend themselves through the use of force, I think is what has kept the party in power.
I'd like to have your assessment on how the lives of Chinese people and China's relationship with the world has evolved over the past 75 years under CCP's rule.
I mean, with regard to that, of course, there are very different kinds of time periods. So that's what's remarkable about the PRC, is that it's gone through such different eras. So first, the idea was to recreate China more or less in the image of the Soviet Union, right, back in the 1950s. Then they broke entirely with the Soviets and went into the Cultural Revolution mode in the 1960s, which basically meant turn everything that had been there before upside down. And then you went to the era of reform that came later on, where most of the things that the party had said in the 1960s were no longer true, right? And these processes have continued all the way up to today. Of course, there have been tremendous successes for China as a country throughout this period. Almost all of those have come since the late 1970s, so during the reform and opening era. The party has had a role to play with regard to that. Much of that role has been positive in the sense of getting out of people's way when it comes to the development of the economy, being willing to accept markets, at least up to a certain point, strengthening education, infrastructure, public health. Any government would have tried to do that. The CCP came to it quite belatedly, but they did well, I mean, during that time period. But that's, again, not the same thing as saying that the successes of China over the past generation belong to the CCP. They belong to the Chinese people who have been able to make use of these new opportunities when the party got out of their way and they could build their own lives and their own society much more the way they wanted than what had been the case before.
What do you think considered to be PRC's greatest achievements over the past 75 years, and what are their most significant challenges today?
So the biggest success, without any doubt, is the economic transformation of China that's taken place over the last generation and a half. It's unprecedented. I mean, we've never seen a country of the size that China has go through this kind of transformation as quickly as China has. When I first came to China back in the late 1970s, it was a dirt poor, terrorized society just after the Cultural Revolution. People were really afraid of most things, speaking their mind, of associating with others, and they were poor. And much of that has been transformed. I mean, even though I'm extremely critical of some of the directions that have been taken under the current CCP leadership in terms of restricting people's ability to act freely and to speak freely. It's still a world away from what was the case when I first came to China in the late 1970s. And in economic terms, people's lives have been entirely transformed. So the biggest challenge for China today is to develop into a country that is rich and strong, but also freer and more pluralistic than what it's been before. And it's on that latter score that the CCP really has significant governance problems. Right? They probably missed an opportunity back in the early 2000s of trying to make it possible for ordinary Chinese to feel more of a responsibility for participating in the governance and the structuring of their country. Right? And then in the 2010s, the CCP moved towards much more repression, much more orientation towards the party at the higher levels itself. This started, by the way, before Xi Jinping, but Xi Jinping has become the symbol in a way of that new trend in terms of making the party more authoritarian.
You mentioned the difference between the 1949, when China was still a war-torn, poor, impoverished country, and now the economic miracle. Yeah. It's like during the first 20 decades, it's like the GDP is in average 10.5%. But on the contrary, like you said, the people without freedom, and people said that China today is a totalitarian. So I want to ask this question: if PRC had not been founded 75 years ago, what might China look today?
It's always difficult to answer those kinds of counterfactual questions because the reality is we don't know. There are so many factors involved in this and so many issues at stake. I have argued before in a book that I did on the Chinese Civil War that some things may not have been all that different from what we saw later on, but I think without the CCP, it would have been possible to avoid some of the biggest disasters of China in the late 20th century, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and what followed from that. It's hard to imagine that any other leadership of China would have taken the country down towards those kinds of depths, those kinds of disasters. So I think without the CCP, China would probably have been more similar to other East Asian development societies, right? Think South Korea, for instance, as one possible example. We don't know. I mean, it's impossible to tell. But the idea, which is so often baked into the CCP version of history, which is that China could only have become rich and strong through the CCP, that's not possible to argue because there were clearly alternatives. There were other people who were thinking about the directions that China would go in, less authoritarian, less oppressive, less violent, right? That were also there in the 1940s and before in Chinese history. So this is where China ended up, and we have to accept that this is where China ended up. But that's different from saying that it was the only possible outcome.
Professor Westad, I ask these questions because I always wonder that, correct me if I'm wrong, before the Civil War and before the war with Japan, there was a golden 10 years, right? I always wonder if that golden 10 years continue after the war with Japan. Wouldn't it be nice, to have a modern China more like other East Asian country, in your opinion?
The question is whether it would have been possible. I mean, it assumes a lot of things ending up differently. The big change was the Japanese invasion and the war against Japan. Right? It was Japan that broke the back of Kuomintang China, the China that had been set up in the late 1920s and 1930s, which also had its own problems with it. I mean, it was in many ways an era of very rapid development in China, but it also had significant problems in terms of authoritarianism and in sort of broader social and cultural terms. It probably would have continued if it hadn't been for the Japanese invasion. I mean, I think the chances that the CCP would have come to power, or even close to power, without the disasters of the Japanese war would have been very, very low, right? But what happened was that the Kuomintang and Chinese government, pre-war Chinese government, was in effect destroyed by that invasion. Even if they managed to survive and they came out still being China's government after Japan capitulated in 1945, they were weakened to a degree that they wouldn't be able to stand up against competitors within China. And the CCP was able to bring a lot of people over onto their side, arguing that they had a plan, they had a concrete measure for how China was going to be ruled in the future. Even people who were not communists, who joined in that direction. So I think what you said is correct. I mean, in the sense that it would have been extremely interesting to see how China would have developed. Of course, we have Taiwan, which is a possible example of what could have happened. I mean, I'm not saying that what did happen in Taiwan in the 1980s and 90s could easily have been replicated on the mainland. I mean, it's not quite like that. But at least we get some idea that the Kuomintang, after all, being a very authoritarian government itself, not least when it got to Taiwan, was able to put that aside and agree to a much more pluralistic democratic orientation, while the CCP has denied China the opportunity of doing that.
Of course, we cannot turn back the time, but like you said, only by understanding the past of China can we better understand China's present and future, right? Professor Westad, do you agree nowadays Beijing is acting more repressively at home and more aggressively abroad?
Yes, I agree with both of those positions. I think what is happening at home, I mean, for the time being, is probably more important than what is happening abroad, although I'm worried about some of the directions that Chinese foreign policy is taking, particularly with regard to the region. So as I said, China did really lose out on a golden opportunity for becoming more pluralistic during the middle years of the reform and opening period around 2000. And the direction that it's taken now is not serving China well. It doesn't solve any questions, because having people afraid of speaking their mind, as we have seen recently, doesn't even help the party resolve questions that are there. It just means, as in the past, that these questions are brushed under the carpet and then postponed to be resolved under probably quite a lot sort of different conditions, probably worse conditions later on. So I think that direction towards repression that you have found over the past decade or so is unfortunate for China. I also think that it's unfortunate for the CCP in many ways. It will probably shorten the time that the CCP has available for carrying out real political reform, which they will have to do at some point without there being serious trouble in political and social terms within China. When it comes to the more assertive Chinese foreign policy that you find within the region, I think that is a fact. This is perhaps less surprising. I mean, this is what happens when countries become more powerful, when they become more significant in terms of their economic development and their position within the region. So in many ways, a more assertive China would have been expected. The question is, how does that assertion manifest itself? So it can take many forms. I mean, I don't think it's unnatural that China has a central place within the international framework of East Asia. That's been the case, as you know, for 2,000 years, right? The question is how it happens. And that's where I'm worried, because what China is doing now, instead of trying to get other countries within the region to cooperate easily with China, is to throw its weight around and antagonize a lot of its neighbors that it really needs to cooperate with, right? That's the problem. China, as Deng Xiaoping's foreign policy showed, China has nothing to gain from that, right? You think about the relationship with Japan, and I'm not here saying that the complications of that are just China's fault. I mean, there are faults on both sides. But China stands more to lose because it wants to be the central power in East Asia. And it cannot, as Deng Xiaoping was fond of pointing out, you cannot do that without having a reasonably good relationship with Japan, right? Deng used to say that China cannot strengthen itself against Japan. It can only strengthen itself with Japan. And he was entirely right in saying that, right? So I'm more hopeful for policy adjustment on the PRC side when it comes to foreign policy than what I am with regard to domestic politics. But for the sake of China, both should be changed, and they should be changed soon.
CCP also claimed it's the founding of PRC 75 years ago in 1949 ended the century of humiliation started 1840. Yeah. Is that really true? Does it really accurately reflect the historical truths, or it's just a political construct to reinforce the nationalism and CCP's ideology?
So I don't really see the century of humiliation in the sense that current CCP leaders and some Chinese historians see it. What I see, as I described in the book Restless Empire, is a China that has interacted with the outside world very closely for a long period of time. Now, it's clear that in the 19th century, early 20th century, a lot of other countries, other imperial countries mainly, started getting into conflict with the Qing Empire. The Qing Empire, of course, was something that many Chinese didn't see as representing China, at least not fully, because it was led by a group of people who many Chinese regarded as not being Chinese, the Manchu. So what the CCP is saying today is basically very different from what it has said in the past, that these wars with other empires that the Qing Empire got itself involved in was somehow a humiliation of China. I really find that a little bit difficult to understand, because you can't have it both ways with regard to this, right? So yes, I mean, there have been foreign aggression, talked about Japan, Western aggression against China in this period. But the idea that this was a continuous century of national humiliation is not something that I see. When I think about the Second World War, when China, led by the Kuomintang, was allied with the West against Japan, or look at earlier time periods where Chinese were able to come to this country or come to other countries and make a life for themselves here and develop skills that they then could bring back to China. So it's not just about that. I mean, the reason why the CCP is so preoccupied with this is very close to what you said, that they need to show that only the party was able to save China from this kind of foreign or foreign-led aggression. And even historically, that's not true, because most of the attempts at predominating over China were actually given up during the Second World War or before the Second World War, when the Kuomintang was still in charge. The interesting thing now is that a very large number of people in China actually believe this to be true, right? And I'm worried about it, because it signals a particular rewriting of Chinese history to serve the purposes of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, again, the CCP is not the only ones who are guilty of this in Chinese history. The Kuomintang did something very similar when they were in power. Then they were the end point, the necessary outcome of everything, right? But the CCP is doing it now, and it's doing it in a way that builds up under a rather primitive form of Chinese nationalism, which I think will not serve the party or China well in the long run. Chairman Mao Zedong used to say that that proposing nationalism, building on nationalism, is a little bit like riding on the back of a tiger. It's okay as long as you can hold the ears of the tiger. You don't fall off. You can use it for your purposes. But if you fall off, it will eat you alive. And he was right about that. And that's also true for what the party is doing now. No. This idea of fueling a very basic form of nationalism could easily be turned against the party in some future scenario.
Like you said, not only Mao Zedong, Xi Jinping also used this century of humiliation to be the foundation for his narratives, including introducing the China Dream back in 2012. And also the 100th anniversary of CCP, he emphasized on the Chinese people now is becoming rich, strong, and standing up. 富起来, 强起来, 站起来了. All based on this century of humiliation.
Xi Jinping is not the only leader who does this. I mean, if you look around the world, all political leaders say, I came to power, I solved the questions that were there before there was chaos, and now I've set things right. So he's not the only leader saying that. But what I worry about is this idea that it's only his increasingly personalized leadership that can prevent things from going back to the way they were before, a very undefined way of what they were before. but some sense of chaos and humiliation and whatnot that existed before the latter stages of CCP policy changes. And that's dangerous because it could mean that he would attempt to stay in power for a very, very long time, maybe forever, maybe for the rest of his life. And that many Chinese would come to identify, at least to a point, his own personal rule with that of the CCP and with that of China. Right? That's dangerous, as we have seen in earlier periods of Chinese history.
I think what you're worrying about is already happening because people think that the wolf warrior diplomacy is stemming from this century of humiliation. What's your assessment on that? How does that impact on the current CCP's foreign policy?
So I think the wolf warriors, in a way, have been reined in to some extent because some of this was just, it went so far that it created more obvious problems for China's long-term diplomacy than what it resolved. It was a time period where, and I sort of understand part of this. I mean, China had been extremely cooperative on a number of issues, for its own reasons, obviously, during the Deng era and after. And you get to a point in the late 2000s, during the time of the Great Recession, where a lot of people within the Chinese leadership are saying, now it's our turn. Now we can set the conditions for what happens internationally. And the wolf warrior idea comes out of that. Always defend China to the hilt. China's never done anything wrong. And secondly, China needs to take a leadership position and signal that very clearly. Right? Now, of course, if you are dependent, that China still is, on the cooperation of others, that's not a very smart way of trying to do it. Right? So I've been saying in Beijing and elsewhere that I understand, as I said to you in this interview, some of the reasons why China has become more assertive in terms of its diplomacy and international orientation. It comes with the growth and strengthening of the country. But I think it's been vastly exaggerated to a degree that actually is not to China's benefit. That's been the problem. And that's, I think, why, at least right now, Xi Jinping and the people at the top are trying to rein in some of the most basic instincts of the wolf warriors in different kinds of forms.
I try to relate this century of humiliation to the current PRC's foreign policy and potentially US-China relations, because I can give you an example I remember vividly in 2021, March, when Biden administration had the first high-level meeting with Beijing, Wang Yi, Yang Jiechi, and Blinken, Sullivan on the other side. Yang Jiechi was so strong to US, and that is 2021, and they are celebrating the 120 years anniversary of the Boxer Protocol in 1901.
Yeah,
So trying to link all this to their strong stance on
for sure.
the relationship with US.
Absolutely. But what's interesting with diplomats such as Yang Jiechi, who I know and who is in many ways a fantastic diplomat, I mean on behalf of his party and on behalf of his country, is that he will act according to what he sees as the order of the day in Beijing, basically the orders that come from the very top of the party. So this idea that you find among quite a few ordinary Chinese, that this is Yang, this is this is the senior leader speaking his mind to these Americans. This was orchestrated. I mean, this was a plan that they had before that meeting actually started. Chinese diplomats of Yang's type never do anything that is just driven by instinct or the moment. So that's the reason, of course, why we are watching so closely to see not just what Chinese leaders and diplomats say, but also the way that they behave.
You know Yang Jiechi personally.
Yes, I know.
What do you think about his harsh words to those US diplomats?
I think it was entirely rehearsed. I think it was planned beforehand. It was something that they wanted to do, probably to play up to what the leaders in Beijing wanted to see. I know him as a very capable diplomat, and the reason I know him is that he was in part trained at the London School of Economics back in the early 1970s, where I worked for almost 20 years. So that's how I got to know him in Beijing.
Okay, back to your book, The Restless Empire. You discuss China's transformation from an empire to a modern state in your book. However, some argue that CCP inherited its totalitarianism from Soviet Union instead of the traditional Chinese culture. What is your opinion on that perspective?
So I think it is to some extent both, Daphne. I think the CCP is still in many ways a very Soviet party. I mean, this was the origins of Chinese communism, was the
all the
Soviet
system,
experiment. Yeah, and
say
how it's organized.
From Soviet.
It is indeed transplanted from the Soviet Union. Of course, it has been changed since then. It's particularly been changed in terms of content during the reform and opening era up to now. But it's clear that the origin is Soviet. It's not only Soviet, though. I mean, some of the ideas also come from the deeper Chinese past, and particularly from the Qing, which is interesting, because the Qing was in many ways a more authoritarian, even totalitarian regime, at least for parts of its existence, than what earlier Chinese empires had been, right? So some of this massive centrality and weight of the state, of the government, of centralization, of the idea that everything had to emanate from one center, right? That's not just Lenin, that's also Qing. You know, it's also this idea that it's only by centralizing purposes, by being very strict in terms of what you want to achieve, that you can reach your goals. So it is in many ways both. What's wrong, though, and many Westerners, I think, make this mistake, is to believe that that deeper historical connection is the only path available for China, which is simply untrue. China has, for most of its existence, been a much more open society, been a much more pluralistic society in many ways, certainly in terms of how people interact with each other, than it was even, you know, during the Qing era, never mind the CCP era later on. So as an historian, I feel that this idea, whether it's from the Chinese side or from the Western side, of sort of restricting what people are able to do and saying it has to be like that or it has to be like this because of longer historical trends, I almost always find that to be untrue.
Have you noticed that more and more US government officials, as well as congressmen, they start to differentiate from CCP and China? Starting last administration, continue to this one. Like the bill they passed, they use CCP instead of China. What's your observation on that?
I'm not a great fan of that. I mean, mainland China only has one government at a time, and at the moment that government is the CCP, right? I understand why it happens. I even sympathize to some extent with the idea of separating between the CCP and CCP leadership and China as such. But, you know, it doesn't come across well even within China itself. It's seen as an attempt to simply try to score points over China in a way by constantly pointing out its authoritarian government. China has the government it has, and it's the only government that is there. Referring to it mainly as the CCP rather than the PRC in China, to me, isn't important. I mean, it's not particularly meaningful.
But can CCP really equal China? You know, because after all, people cannot vote for their leadership,
that's right? And that's true in a lot of countries, unfortunately. But still, you know, China has the leadership that it has at the moment, and it's up to the Chinese people then to decide whether they want to live with this kind of governance or whether they want to improve that governance.
Professor Westad, you are an expert of Chinese history. So my next question is that we remember in 2013, the Economist cover, you know, depict Xi Jinping wearing that imperial dragon robe, and you just mentioned like he might rule for life. Yeah. Do you think like he really want to be an old-style emperor? Back in Chinese history, which Chinese emperor can resemble Xi the most, in your opinion? Because people compare Xi with Qin Huang and Chongzhen, and some say that he's Qianlong. I don't know your opinion. Can you share with us, please?
It's different. I mean, you know, he has many of those traits coming in from the past that you see among Chinese rulers and rulers elsewhere. If you think about it on the Chinese side, there are some similarities with the Qianlong emperor. One of the most important things about the Qianlong emperor is that he ruled for far too long, for 60 years. 60 years, and then he resigned in order to uphold the memory of his grandfather, who had ruled, the Kangxi emperor, had ruled for 60 years.
Like together, like 120.
Indeed. But he still, the Qianlong Emperor, still continued to rule from behind the curtain even after he resigned. And the point is that things in the latter part of Qianlong's very long time in power got worse and worse. He got older. It was harder to do the sort of day-to-day business that he needed to do. He was a very hard-working man, which I think Xi Jinping is as well. But there are limits to how much one person can do, right, in terms of being able to direct a country as vast as China. And when you've been in that position for very long, you would tire, you would wear out, but you would also start to think of yourself as infallible, right? And that's what the Qianlong Emperor did as well. I mean, the idea that he had been doing this for so long that he could make no mistakes. Internationally, by the way, the one that Xi Jinping reminds me of, perhaps even more than past Chinese emperors, is what happened in the Soviet Union towards the end of its existence. So Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader who ruled for a very long time, from the early 60s to the early 80s, reminds me quite a bit of the kind of leadership style that you have for Xi Jinping now. Not to rock the boat, increasingly authoritarian, being willing to accept, more positive social and economic developments when it's acceptable to do so within the party, but not having any new plans, really for where you want to go domestically, right? And then becoming older and the world narrowing down more and more, and things just continue the way they've been before. That's what I fear about China more than anything else. I mean, the Qianlong Emperor was also a symbol of that stagnation in a way towards the end of his rule. When people rule too long, this is what happens.
We talk about China's past today, and I'd like to have your view on China's future under Xi's rule, considering all the features you discuss in your book, as well as the new factors emerging under Xi's rule during the past 12 years.
It's very hard to foretell what is going to happen. I think the economy will be a very important part of all of this.
No, it's in crisis.
If the Chinese economy takes a serious downturn, I mean more serious than what we are seeing at the moment, then I think internal unrest will increase. I think party repression probably will increase as a result of that. It's a strange kind of situation because I think the current leadership in China knows what they have to do in order to improve the economy, but they're not willing to do it because they're afraid of losing control. Right? So it's a classic situation of an aging leadership, understanding that there is a crisis, but for their own reasons and for their own benefit, not being willing or able to do much about it. I mean, that's the scenario that I see at the moment. And that's quite a bad combination, for China's future. Now, the CCP in the past has shown enormous ability, as I said, to be flexible, to overcome these kinds of challenges. I would not at all rule out that happening now as well. But I don't think it would happen with the current leadership in power. So I think the chances of Xi himself continuing as General Secretary, continuing as leader of the party, that he would be able to put in place the reforms that China's economy now so badly needs, I think that's wishful thinking. I don't think that's going to happen. So the question is now, what happens first? Is it a deepening crisis, or is it a change in direction? And if it's the former, if the crisis becomes very severe, then it is a question of whether this regime will survive in the form that it has now.
In addition to PRC's 75th anniversary and also China's history today and future, I'd like to explore the US-China relationship through your recent Foreign Affairs article, Sleepwalking Toward War. You draw a parallel between the Anglo-German tensions before World War I and today's US-China relations. Given these structural similarities, do you think we have passed the point of avoiding conflict, or do we still have room for conflict resolution?
So I think there is room for conflict resolution. I mean, I think it's possible for the Sino-American relationship to move in a direction, even with the current leadership in place in Beijing, that is more stable, more balanced than what it is at present. But I think it will be hard, and it will need a lot of work from both sides. The key issue for me, in order to get out of this sleepwalking kind of situations, which worries me a great deal in terms of relations between the two countries, is first and foremost to have more open, more direct, more plentiful communications between the two sides. I mean, that is improving at the moment, but it's improving very, very slowly. There was a long period where there was so little interaction between the Chinese and the US side that I got really worried about it. I mean, particularly in sort of military to military contexts. And some of that has improved. China and the United States are never going to see eye to eye on a number of very big questions in terms of world politics, in terms of what happens in Asia. But they need to communicate because they are both very significant great powers. And we need to avoid a direct conflict between them. And the second point is about respect. So, and this goes back to what I said about me not liking the idea of saying the CCP is one thing and the Chinese people is another. China has one government at a time. You have to show that government some degree of respect in order to be able to deal with them meaningfully and deal with them, you know, in the same kind of way that the United States was able to deal with the Soviet Union during significant parts of the Cold War. By talking about issues that both sides were interested in, by sometimes competing, sometimes even competing violently, but having the level of respect in terms of communications and in terms of stature that avoided a big disaster in relations between the two. China and the United States need to do exactly that. And this is where the situation before the First World War worries me, right? Because of the similarities that you see, the decline in terms of communication, the decline in terms of respect, the decline in terms of ideas that one could actually achieve something, even if it's very limited, by having some degree of acceptance of working with the other side.
You argue that while structural forces push states, nations into conflicts, it's ultimately individual's decision, leader's decision triggered a war. Do you see any specific actions from either Xi Jinping or US leaders that could, I use your word, sleepwalk toward the war?
Absolutely. I see far too many. This is the challenge that people who work on history have, is that when you see these similarities, I mean, the similarities are never total, they're never complete. For instance, if I compare the early 20th century, the time before the First World War, to the time that we live in now, there are many similarities, but it's not a sort of full or total similarity. But I do see many causes for conflict. I worry about relations over Taiwan a great deal. I worry about what happens when the North Korean regime collapses, which it will at some point. I worry about South China Sea issues. I worry about the relationship between China and India. There are so many of these possible flashpoints that are there. The relationship with Japan. What's interesting is that very few of these are bilateral Sino-American issues, right? But the American presence in the Pacific is something that leads in the direction of more conflict points that are there, with China's power rising. And that's where I see the similarities, right, in terms of the First World War and how it actually broke out. These are the structural framework. And then you have individual crises in which leaders need to understand that a big war doesn't serve anyone's interests. I mean, that if there were a war between the United States and China, and we should think more about the possibility for that actually happening than what we do, it would be an absolute disaster for humankind. You know, even if it doesn't become an all-out nuclear war, even if the worst weapons of mass destruction are not used or used sparingly, this would set global development back by several generations. It would be exactly what happened in 1914, that the world that we knew before ceased to exist, and we got a new, much worse world that came out of this war, irrespective of who wins and who loses. Right? So the point here is to avoid that kind of war, avoid that kind of conflict.
The part in your article which interests me the most is that you compare Xi Jinping's support for Putin to Kaiser Wilhelm II's backing of Austria-Hungary. Could you elaborate on that? Additionally, I have noticed there's more similarities between Xi Jinping and Kaiser Wilhelm II. Not only their hubris and fear, but also their background. their naval ambition, and also their personalities are also very similar. Do you find more similarities between these two, and how might that reshape the geopolitics today?
So on the similarities between Wilhelm and Xi, there are some very striking similarities, as you note. I mean, both of them had a difficult relationship with their fathers, with their families overall. It was very, very difficult in terms of Xi's own upbringing to have a sort of natural relationship with his father. The same thing is true in Wilhelm's case, both for his father and his grandfather. And that produces a need to prove yourself, to show that you are the real leader in charge when you have taken over power. I think there are, in those broad psychological terms, some similarities. But much more important, I think, is the overall issue of how people react in terms of crisis and crisis behavior. And particularly with regard to the kind of situation that we see at the moment. So and that's where the comparison with Austria-Hungary comes in. So the reason, as we all know, why the First World War broke out was not because of German aggression by itself. It was because of German willingness to back up Austria, its ally, in the many conflicts that Austria had with countries around its borders, right? That was the real trouble when the crisis in the summer of 1914 actually got underway. And that seems to me to be quite similar to what China is doing now with regard to Russia, right? China doesn't really have an inherent interest in supporting Russia as fully as it has done during the war in Ukraine. But it feels that it has to do it because Russia, like China, is in a conflict with the United States, and because they are afraid of losing the only big partner that they can have in international politics if they do not support Russia strongly enough, right? That was exactly Wilhelm's problem with regard to Austria-Hungary, right? Like Russia today, Austria back then was a decrepit old empire on the borders of the rising great power, you know, Germany back in the late 19th century, and China today, right? And then the rising great power makes the decision that it is in its inherent interest, the interest of the leadership, to back up what this empire next door actually does, without thinking about the longer term consequences that could lead to. That worries me for China today as well. I mean, one can understand why China at the moment is interested in supporting Russia because of the relationship or the difficulties in the relationship with the United States, right? But what China expects to get out of this in the longer run is less certain to me. The cost that China has borne so far through that support is enormous. Maybe not first and foremost in relations with the United States, but in relations to Europe. So the European position vis-a-vis China has changed dramatically after the war in Ukraine broke out. And public opinion in Europe has changed. Official policies with regard to China have changed. And the reason for that is that so many Europeans, and Europe after all is China's biggest trading partner, right? And probably will be more significant in many ways in the future, that they believe that China is willing to support and bankroll Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And they don't know what's going to happen next, right? They are fearful of that. They're fearful of where Putin and Russia will turn next vis-a-vis Europe. And if they believe, as they do now, that China is sort of willing to accept that and willing to continue to support and work with Russia while Russia is behaving aggressively towards European countries and elsewhere, that will have a terrible effect for the European relationship with China long term. So those are some of the similarities that I see, right, between the situation now and the situation before 1914. And I think on both sides, not just in Beijing, but in Washington as well, one needs to take these parallels seriously. They are not absolute. But then, you know, in the summer of 1914, almost no one thought that global war would break out. And then just a few weeks later, we were in exactly that kind of situation. So we have to think about these things. We have to think about war as possible. We have to think about how we deal with our near and far alliances and friendships in a way that builds up under the possibility of actually creating some kind of balance in the international system rather than trying to tear it apart.
You are also an expert in Russia, I know. So how do you feel when you hear Xi Jinping invited Putin to be his partner to drive this once-in-a-century global transformation? Do you worry that Taiwan will be the next Ukraine when they both want to restore their imperial glory?
I don't think the two issues, Ukraine and Taiwan, are immediately connected. But I do think that there are very strong and important voices in Beijing who are watching very closely what happens in the Ukraine case and then are trying to learn from that in terms of policy towards Taiwan. And what I mean by that is that this is a question first and foremost of Western resolve. Is the West willing to continue to back Ukraine? Is it possible to get some kind of solution to the Ukrainian crisis that does not reward Russian aggression, or at least not reward it in a way that makes Russia into the victor of this war? Because if that were to happen, I think a lot of people in Beijing would be telling themselves, well, if we then need to behave aggressively towards Taiwan, we can get away with it. We can do it incrementally and achieve some of the same things that the Russians have achieved with regard to Ukraine. So that is what worries me, and this is the reason why I'm, even though I understand the concerns that some people in the United States have with saying that Ukraine is a diversion and what the United States should really focus on is its relationships within East Asia. I understand that point of view from a resource perspective and from a preparedness perspective. But I don't think the conclusion to that kind of concern should be that the United States in any way should lessen its support for Ukraine. Because the idea that this is a sort of zero-sum kind of setup, that it's only by basically giving up the fighting in Ukraine that the United States can focus fully on East Asia, that I think is fundamentally untrue. I agree that long-term it's the rivalry with China and the situation in East Asia, meaning building believable deterrence from the side of the United States with regard to the Taiwan Straits and other kinds of crises. That matters much more than what happens in the European East. But they are connected in the way that perceptually, if the United States and Europe were to give up in terms of its support for Ukraine, this would lead to Beijing drawing exactly the wrong conclusions with regard to Taiwan.
Speaking of Taiwan, I believe you have read President Lai Ching-te's recent comment saying that CCP's desire to annex Taiwan is less about the territorial integrity, but more about reshaping the global order. Do you think Xi's true goal or his ambition is about the national greatness or the global dominance?
I read Lai's comments with great interest. I mean,
So the question, why not just asking for
I think it's an interesting.
Russia?
Yes, I think it's an interesting idea in many ways. I mean, what makes it complicated is in a way that it's both, right? I mean, it's clear that the idea of some form of what they would call national reunification is increasingly high up on the list for the CCP leadership. There's no doubt about that. I was in Beijing in the late spring, and I saw it very clearly then. So that's real, and it's centered on Taiwan, and it's not just a part of making China into a more complete global power. But of course, it's connected to it, right? So this is the reason why I worry in a way that I haven't done for more than a generation about relations in the Taiwan Strait. That a lot of people in China, not just Xi himself, but others as well, are saying we cannot achieve the kind of status, the kind of position that we want to have globally without achieving national reunification over Taiwan, which is a very incomplete way of thinking about it in reality, right? Because just like Germany did before 1914, they're putting pressure on the one issue that is almost certain, if war were to break out, to lead to a direct confrontation between China and the United States, right? That's what worries me. So if the road to global greatness goes through Taiwan, well, it might end with Taiwan as well. Just like the idea for Austria of controlling areas in the Balkans or in the southeastern parts of Europe, and Germany being willing to back that up, led to the end of the prospective hegemony of Germany within Europe. So there is a parallel there. And it worries me. I mean, it also worries me in military terms, because I'm concerned that by putting this emphasis on Taiwan, that so many planners in Beijing do these days, not just military, but military as well, they are in a way doing a little bit like what the Germans did in a very concrete kind of sense prior to 1914. They are making the pressure point exactly the kind of scenario in which a war between the United States and China becomes most likely. Right? That's what I worry about. So what Lai said is correct up to a point, but it doesn't take the pressure off Taiwan. I mean, it would still be oriented towards what happens in Taiwan. It's not only Taiwan, but it's probably Taiwan first.
Professor Westad, we are all students learning from history and past. So as we conclude the interview, what is your advice for US future presidents or Xi Jinping about how to prevent from sleepwalking toward the war?
So I go back to what I said earlier on, Daphne. I think the most important thing right now is to stabilize the situation between the two countries in a broader strategic sense. And that can only be achieved if there is a higher degree of understanding of what the strategic aims are on both sides. And that means more and more in-depth communication between the two sides, much more frequent meetings between the leaderships of the two sides. I also think on the Chinese side that it's well worth for the Chinese leadership, this Chinese leadership and whoever would succeed it, to think about how China achieves its international aims. So if you want to make China rich and strong on a global scale, and China is in many ways moving towards that, the last thing that China wants to see, if it believes that its future is great and glorious, is to have a war that would destroy all of that. Right? This is equally true from the US side. But if the belief on the Chinese side is, as Xi so often says, that the future belongs to them, right? The worst thing that they can do is to destroy that future by moving in the only direction, I believe, that would certainly undermine it for many generations, and that is through a great power war. So that would be my advice. I mean, take war seriously. We don't like to think about war, right? And for good reasons. War is an absolutely terrible thing, and great power wars are much more destructive than any other kind of war. But we still need to think about it in order to learn how to avoid it. And that, I think, is what the two leaderships should learn from looking at history, that sometimes things get out of hand very, very quickly. And we have to have safeguards to try to prevent that from happening in our own time.
Thank you so much, Professor Westad.
It's been a pleasure.
Truly appreciate your time, and always a pleasure being a student of history. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.